Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Tom Hastings, and I'm an educator here at Cheehaw Park and Zoo, Flint River Aquarium, and Thranatiska Heritage Center. And today we are going to be talking about a topic that is about keeping our environment clean and super enjoyable. And so we're going to be talking about this concept of leave no trace. And so what this is relevant towards is environmental recreation and outdoor opportunities. And so when I think about leave no trace, this is actually really important to me because I love hiking. That's my number one favorite activity in my free time is hiking and going out and exploring natural areas and taking pictures of wildlife and vegetation and some really cool plants. So this is really important to me because I think leave no trace is really important. And so I wanted to share with you all some guidelines or what we're going to refer to as the principles of leave no trace. And so really when I think about this in general, before I go into the actual principles, I think about just keeping the environment as clean as possible and doing everyday little things to help make sure that this is possible. And so, when I go out and I hike, I like to see things as natural as possible, as clean as possible, because if you went out to a really pristine area where there was nobody else, that's how it would look. You wouldn't see a lot of trash, or you wouldn't see things like, I don't know, paint on anything. And so I just think about, if you're going out and hiking too, then that means you probably enjoy the outdoors. And so why not keep it clean and tidy for everybody, right? Because it looks way cooler like that, and it's a lot more enjoyable, and it feels cleaner and fresher. And so I think that's what the idea behind Leave No Trace is, or at least that's what it means to me. And so what Leave No Trace really is just general practices that everybody can do to keep the environment and natural landscapes as clean, protected, and enjoyable as possible. And so I'm going to present a PowerPoint, but before I do that, we like to think about who this is relevant towards. And so typically when we think about Leave No Trace, we think about it in terms of people who are going on some really cool extreme trips, like such as backpacking trips or going on long camping trips where you have to actually pack everything in, because then there's lots of potential for covering lots of ground and you have to pack in more food. So for those of you who aren't familiar, people oftentimes go on backpacking trips where they camp for multiple nights at a time out in a wild, remote area. And to do this, you have to pack in everything you're going to need to be out in the woods for 3 days. So things like a tent and clothes and food and things to cook your food on and utensils. But that also means you're bringing a lot in with you. And so Leave No Trace is definitely relevant for people who are going to go on some of these more intense trips. But that doesn't mean it's just relevant to what we call our backcountry people who are going into the back of country land and wild lands and doing these remote trips. It's just as relevant to what we call our front country people, which these are going to be people that are more like everyday people who are, you can drive to the site you're going to go to. It's more like day use people who are just going to go on a day hike or go fishing for the day. Things like that. We're going to take their dog for a walk. So it could be visiting not necessarily out in the woods, but just state parks and landscapes like that. And so, in short, this is relevant to everybody, because whether or not you're going far out into the woods where you want to see really clean and pristine areas, we like our parks to just be as clean as possible as well, right? Like we could like going to a clean park, not one where we see trash everywhere. And so this is relevant for everybody, and everything that we're going to talk about can be relevant for everybody. And so I'm going to present my screen. Actually, before I do that, I should mention that a lot of the principles I'm going to be talking about are principles that have actually been studied and recommended by a group that is supported by REI, which is an outdoor company, and also other really important organizations. So this is actually, these recommendations are actually based off of research on recreational activities and findings and observing people that are partaking in environmental recreation and a human dimensions aspect of how people appreciate their environment and their natural settings that they get to go out and visit. And so these were actually developed by a group known as the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics. So I'm going to throw in my own thoughts and examples throughout this as well, but in general, this has been the basis of their work. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And so we can talk about these different principles or these different areas that we should be thinking about and considering when going out on any type of recreational trip or activity or anything like that. And so in general, there's a lot of different threats to natural landscapes. So anything that we use, and this can be anything from people littering, and there are lots of different types of litter. Litter does not just mean physical trash. Littering can mean leaving something that wasn't there, marking things. You can litter with different types of waste. Another threat is invasive species. So for people who move from one natural landscape to another, or that are really avid hikers, there's potential that they bring animals or plants from one area to another. So invasive species or species getting moved around can be a threat to natural landscapes. And this is definitely relevant because invasive species have the potential to really thrive in new landscapes and outcompete other animals or plants. And so moving invasive species around can actually have lots of long-standing and difficult to handle impacts, and it requires a lot of work to try to get those invasive species under control. So we really want to try to be aware of what we're transferring from area to area, and we're going to talk about that more when we get further into this talk. Another one is habituated wildlife, or just impacts on wildlife in general. So I have a picture of a polar bear here. Bears in general are typically thought of as a type of wildlife that can, start to have conflicts with people. And sometimes that's because they are really good at getting into trash and getting used to people. And so the more often they're around people, the more dangerous it can be. And we'll talk more about this later. Trail erosion, depending on how they're built, how many people are using them, if people are using them properly, and polluted waters. Again, that kind of comes back to litter, that we can have our landscapes getting impacted in different ways. Okay, so when thinking about actually doing our recreational activities, we're going to jump into what we now call our 7 principles of Leave No Trace. The first one is plan ahead and be prepared for trips. Now, this one's not necessarily as relevant to not leaving a trace, but it is important to thinking about when you are going out on these activities. This is really important to think about prior to any activities. And so this is important to think about because it can prevent problems. So the more prepared you are, the less likely you are to run into problems, such as stressing out if you do run into a problem, getting tired because you're exhausting different ideas, you're running out of time, you're fatiguing yourself both mentally and physically. So when you get prepared and you're planned properly, hopefully you won't run into any major issues that would cause you to get fatigued over time, because you already know how long you're going to be out for. And if you do start to get stressed and fatigued and it continues to persist, this can lead to a little bit of fear or getting scared. And then also you can, start to make bad decisions. So in general, planning ahead and being prepared is super important. And a number of different ways that you can do this, or important ones that I'm going to focus on, is know the destination you're going to and its route. So whenever I go hiking, no matter what, I know what my hike is going to be for the day. I look up the route before I go on that hike. One of the most important ones is knowing how long of a hike it is and what the elevation gain is. So a lot of hikes, you can hike pretty far if you're just going on flat ground, right? Because that's more of a pace that we're used to on a daily basis. But if you have a really big elevation gain, it's going to take way longer. It's going to be way more strenuous. It's going to tire you out a lot more. But as long as you know and you've made an informed decision to go on it, then you're preparing yourself for it. So you are prepared mentally that you're going on this long hike. And then you know when you need to leave by, when you should be getting to certain points by. So when I'm doing these hikes, I even think about, what's my turnaround time if things, don't go as planned. When am I going to turn around and head back towards the car? Even if I want to get to the top, I know it's too late. So that's a great way to be prepared or to be thinking ahead as well. And then just, know the route, what's to be expected on it and where you're going. And then another big one is not only planning where you're going and what you're doing for the day, but packing and planning what you need to appropriately bring with you in order to make this trip a success and to make it comfortable. Not even just a success. You want to be comfortable during your hike and you want to enjoy it. So bringing the things you need are going to make that way more enjoyable and less stressful. So what I have here is a picture of, what a day pack might look like for someone going on a hike or doing any other kind of recreational activity, even if you're going to be out on the water for a while, say fishing or anything like that. So I see things such as maybe a first aid kit, always important, always nice to have. I see things like a map and a guide. I always, that's a big part of also planning and preparing and knowing your hike is bringing a map with you so that if you do come to a split, you can confirm which way you want to go or anything like that. And also bringing a map that has mile markers on it is a really good way of knowing how far you've gone and trying to figure out how much further you have to go so that you can time things as well. So I see a map in here that's really good. There could be things like a compass in here. First aid, let's see, sunglasses are always nice. Food is a big one. I never go on a hike without food, right? And I always overpack food just in case, because it doesn't hurt to have a little bit more than you need. And then probably the most important one for me, or the next two are the most important ones for me, is water. I always bring way too much water because this, a lot of recreational outdoor activities can be, tiring, and you might want to drink a lot, and staying hydrated is super important. So always bring water. And then the biggest one, which I've learned from quite often, is bringing a raincoat. Even if you don't think it's going to rain, bring a raincoat because you will not regret it when it starts downpouring. And especially on trips that are overnight trips or something like that. If it's a day hike and you're going to be within a couple miles of your car anyway, and you've checked out the weather forecast, then that's okay. But I always bring one anyway because they're pretty lightweight anyway, and they're worth having, and you won't regret it. And speaking of that, actually, that's another really good thing you can do to be prepared, which I also always do, is check out the weather forecast before you go on any serious trips, because weather is going to play a very important role in how far you can get, how fast your trip is going, what conditions you actually need to be worried about. So, weather can be dangerous sometimes if there's some big storms rolling through. So you just, check the conditions of whatever location you're going to for the day. That can also help you be very prepared, both mentally and in terms of what you pack. Okay. Another one is use land surfaces appropriately. So this one is really important in terms of leaving no trace. So when we think about leaving no trace, we can oftentimes think about not leaving trash or things like that, but think about it. If you leave a lot of footprints behind, that's a type of trace. You're leaving that behind and you're impacting the environment. So this one's really cool to think about, and it oftentimes is not think about. But a lot of times when you go on a hike, especially in areas that have actually designated the hikes and have them on a map, if you're essentially going on a hike that's on a map, or you're going camping in the backcountry, more oftentimes than not, there's going to be a previously established trail. And this is on purpose. We want people to use the same trail. And that's because we want to minimize the impact to the rest of the environment. So if there's a trail already built in place, you might as well use that rather than walking to the side of it and then stepping all over a whole lot of vegetation that's, in pretty good condition. Why step on that when you can just step on the trail that everybody else is using? So it makes sense, but it's something to think about. Trails are there on purpose, and it's not just to be nice for us to walk on, it's also to protect the surrounding environment, especially when you're hiking in really cool and natural areas. And then once you get to wherever you're going, if you are going to set up a tent or pick out a spot for picnicking and snacking, try to use areas that'll also already look worn down. Why set up a tent on a bunch of really fresh, good looking grass or vegetation when there's a dirt patch right next to it, right? That's probably been a site where tents are commonly laid down. So it's usually pretty obvious at campgrounds or even in more natural locations that you're hiking out to, like backcountry campgrounds, where people put the tents up at each site. So try to reuse those. Why create even more large dirt patches that have been, destroyed by tents going up? And then think about too, just for your own safety, like what's a good type of surface to put your tent on? You don't want to put it in something that could, like flood up and fill with water or anything like that. So, rock, gravel, snow, these are all good surfaces you can put a tent on. All right. Now I've been stressing stay on the trail, but that's if you're in a really populated area, or like I said, an area where trails are established on purpose because we know there's going to be a lot of foot traffic, and because, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people visit that site a day. And so that's when that's important. Now, on the flip side, if you're going to an area to explore and you're going off trail and it's not a populated area, and in fact, you're there for different reasons, then the idea is to spread out. You don't want, let's say you go in with a group of 4 people, you don't want all 4 people to follow in the same footpath, because then you are going to start to form the basis of a trail or a worn out area. Rather, if all 4 of you walk on a different path, then there's potential that the veg isn't going to die and it's going to rebound rather quickly. And so just to give you guys an example of this, I did research out in the subarctic, and when we're walking out there, that's not a spot that people visit often or even are supposed to visit, because I'm doing my research in a really, relatively untouched landscape. And so when I walk to all my sites and when I go out there with other people, none of us walk one behind the other. We oftentimes walk, kind of fanned out. And that's because we don't want to disturb some of the vegetation that can be really sensitive, like this lichen. So this lichen, it looks really cool and it kind of looks like cauliflower or something like that, right? But when you step on it, it crunches and it gets destroyed. And so we don't want to have a patch that eventually gets destroyed to the point where no lichen's ever going to come back there. We'd rather spread out and, not have as much of an impact on the lichen or any of the other vegetation. So we don't want to create permanent paths in landscapes like this that are relatively untouched. So if for any reason you are in an area that's not on path and you're walking, try to spread out so you don't, have any lasting impacts or impacts that are going to take longer to recover from. So something cool to think about, the differences of when you should follow in a line and stay on the path and when not to. All right, this is one of the ones that seems a bit more likely to focus on, and that's proper waste disposal. But with that being said, there's lots of different types of waste, like I mentioned, that needs to be properly disposed of. It's not necessarily just picking up trash or picking up garbage. So it refers to everything. And there's a common phrase, if you pack it in, you pack it out, which means everything you come into the natural landscapes with should come out, because that's not something that was there beforehand. So there's no reason for it to be left there afterwards, right? And so this can include things like trash. It can be even anything like if a party or tent pops off, even though that's not you intentionally littering, it still doesn't need to, no one wants to come upon a piece of tent, flying around out in the woods or anything like that. And this one's important to mention just because oftentimes it isn't people littering on purpose. Like I mentioned, a lot of people who go out in these natural landscapes want to see it clean too. And so they're not doing it on purpose. It could even be something like a water bottle, falling out of the pocket of your backpack, because a lot of backpacks now have, water bottle holders. So a lot of times it's not intentional, but a good way to try to prevent this from happening is to, especially if you're at a designated area like a campground, is to do a lap before you leave. Just physically take a walk around your entire campground and look to see if there's any trash that you may not have even known about is there. and that can, help reduce how much is left over out in natural areas. And just hold it. You don't even have to bring it home with you. Areas like Sequoia National Park have trash cans that have both recycling and trash that are safe for wildlife, like this one that they can't get into, located all over the place. So as soon as you get out onto off a trail, there's usually trash cans at the beginning and end of all of them. So, they make it pretty easy and, relatively not frustrating to get rid of all your waste. All right, let's talk about now if you're actually out in the woods. Something else you may not think about is disposing of things like toothpaste. But if you're on long backpacking trips, right, you have to brush your teeth still, right? You can't go 4 to 5 days without brushing your teeth. And even when you cook, you still use dishes, right? You're not just eating out of your hand the whole time. We're not getting, that into being out in the backcountry. So you still have dishes, which means you still have to wash it. But what they recommend is that you actually bring it and you disperse it. So the first thing you don't want is you don't want to just dump your dishwater and do your dishes in camp, because what's that going to do? That's going to attract animals to where you're sleeping at night, and that can be a little bit dangerous. And you just don't want to have lots of fun noises outside your tent. And so the first thing you have to think about is where can you properly go and dispose of your dishwater and things like that, or even your toothpaste, because toothpaste, it smells good, right? We clean our teeth to keep them fresh and clean, right? So it smells good. That also means it smells really good, which means animals are going to be able to smell it from far away. So you don't want to attract them close to your tents either. So just think about when you're at a campground, go at least like 200 feet from yourself, from your campground, and also go 200 feet from any nearby water sources. So we don't want anything draining off into water sources like human waste or our food or dishwater or anything like that. We don't want it draining into our waterways, our fresh wetlands or streams that are out in these natural landscapes. So something cool to think about. It's not necessarily just trash. All right, campfires is another big one. So when you're out and you're doing these recreational activities, campfires are fine sometimes when you're at established campgrounds and they have a fire ring built. But when you are at these sites, make sure you use the fire ring. Don't try to build a campfire somewhere else, because first, we don't need to look at multiple, fire sites. And second, those fire rings are built on purpose in a way that can help prevent the spread of fire. And so they are safer and they help keep fires more manageable, which is what we want. And it can prevent some really bad impacts. And then check regulations is another big one. So oftentimes when I go hiking, especially out west, or even down south where it can get a bit drier and hotter, there's oftentimes bans on fires or regulations on when fires can occur. So if things have gotten too dry and or even if there's going to be windy conditions or anything like that, sometimes there are going to be updates that say we're not allowing fires right now in this park. Please use other resources. And so that's fine. And there's other things you can do other than have a fire at night. You can do things like go stargazing and hang out, and there's alternatives. So that brings up a really good point. So if you can't have a fire, sometimes the second nice thing about a fire is it keeps you warm and it provides light. So other things that are really, really important to pack on any kind of trip that you're doing recreational, even if it's just like a fishing trip where you think you might be out till late, a headlamp or a flashlight is always a good thing to have as a source of light, and not relying on your cell phones for a flashlight, because cell phones lose battery and they die. So having a real source of light that you can rely on can be your best friend sometimes, and it oftentimes is my best friend when I'm out doing my hiking trips. That's a really important one. And layers. You always want to be right? Again, you always want to, be prepared. Have layers so that you can stay warm and comfortable, especially if you can't have a fire. And then think about alternatives. So if you can't have a fire, you can use something like this. So this is a cook stove, a little handy cook stove. All you have to do is just light it really quick and it produces a little flame, and it's the same thing as what you have at home, except it's portable. and you just put a pot right on top of that, and they're actually super efficient at getting water boiling. Some of them can get water boiling within just a couple minutes, depending on how much water, of course. But it's a good alternative. So if you can't have a fire to cook your food, then you can pack in things that are still super lightweight. These are incredibly light, and they can be really good. And then another one that, when thinking about fires, is where you're getting your firewood. So a big thing to think about is not bringing firewood from other locations to new locations. So don't travel with firewood, because you can bring diseases that may be on the wood. You can bring insects or animals that may be hiding inside of logs or stumps. And then if you bring that wood, they could get released, and then that could be a source of spreading invasive species. So remember, I talked about that could be one of the potential negative impacts on natural environments. Well, this is one way in which we could spread invasive species and not even know it. Again, so it's not always intentional. We don't know we're bringing invasive species with us in that firewood, but nonetheless, it could happen. So try to either get your firewood, buy it wherever you're going to be hiking, whatever location you're going to be at, in the same town at least, or try to find it out in the wild if that's allowed wherever you are. But try to stay away from bringing firewood from one location to another and traveling long distances with it. Okay. And then another big one, so this kind of comes back to leaving a trace can be more than just trash or anything. And it could not only be, leaving our footprints and being concerned about where we're walking or setting up in our tent, but also just everything else. Like there's lots of things we can touch when we're out in like native landscapes. And so we just ask that you try to observe more than you touch. And if you are going to touch something, to make sure you put it back how you found it. And so this is something I have to be super, cognizant of and be thinking about when I'm outdoors, because another one of my favorite activities is going out and looking for animals. And my favorite animal or type of animal, which is an amphibian, likes to spend lots of time under rocks or logs or stumps or other flat objects. And so I'm guilty of going out and flipping a lot of rocks to look for really cool animals, which you have to be safe of here in Georgia, because there can be some not so friendly animals under rocks, I should mention. So I'm from up north where we don't have too many venomous animals like snakes. So be careful about that. But the idea is that if I'm going to, flip a rock or a log looking for a salamander or frogs, that's what I'm looking for most of the time. Then it's just important to make sure you put it back how you found it, because we want to, again, give off as little impact as possible, leave areas looking as natural as they would. So, put a rock back where it was found. It can just be a big way. If everybody always turned over everything and moved it, we would see a lot of logs, and we would see the undersides and it would be dirty. And then we would also see where the log was resting, and it would not look clean and neat. So it can also just be a good way to keep the area looking clean and neat. And then kind of coming back to the firewood topic of making sure you don't bring firewood from location to location, make sure you don't bring anything with even on your shoes back to new areas. So it's not always a bad idea to, wash your boots to make sure you're not transferring anything from one natural landscape to another. So I have a picture of a cave here. And so oftentimes people wash their boots. There's even boot washing stations, especially at things like national parks, if there's caves present, for people to wash their boots so that they're not transferring any diseases or anything that could impact animals like bats. So bats have what's called white nose syndrome, which is a disease that impacts their nose, and it can make them really sick and lead to deaths in bats. And so one really good way to help keep bats safe is to prevent the spread of that disease or that bacteria. And so one good way to do that is to wash your boots after you leave a cave, so that if you are going to go into any caves in the future or just other areas in general, there's no potential to spread anything from cave to cave and impact more bats. So that's one really cool example of, things you might not even think of, that we can spread more things than just, trash and footprints. We can spread diseases and, other animals and things like that. And then another big one too to think about when thinking about not bringing things from one location to another is plants on boats. So oftentimes when people go in wetlands or waterways, plants will get stuck to the bottom of their boats or in, the rudders and the motors. And so cleaning all of that off and hosing your boats off and stuff, or even canoes or kayaks and their paddles before you put them in another body of water can prevent plant populations from getting established in new areas, because there can be some pretty invasive aquatic plants as well. A big one is not to bother wildlife. So we should never be approaching or feeding wildlife. You definitely don't want to approach wildlife because you never know how it's going to respond and you're just disturbing them. So even if it's a type of wildlife that's not dangerous, you're still going to be disturbing and bothering them, especially animals like birds that are near their nests. Like we don't want to make them fledge and leave their young or their eggs. And animals can be dangerous. So it's not always wise to approach wildlife, and feeding them is definitely something we don't want to do. And that comes back to one of the other topics I talked about that can be a big negative impact, which is habituating wildlife, which means essentially what that means is that wildlife gets comfortable being around people and they get comfortable with the stimuli that people provide and they become less worried about people. So the more used to people they get, the less worried they are of us. And that can really lead to wildlife coming around more often. And this can be bad if it is a type of wildlife that can be harmful or dangerous, such as a bear. So to provide a couple examples, in Maine, where I went to school, there's bears are getting a lot more comfortable going into trash cans and things like that in people's yards. And so that's creating more human wildlife conflict. And so making sure we properly store our food. So maybe doing things like, keeping your trash cans in your garages until it's the night of trash takeout rather than storing them outside somewhere can prevent bears from coming around. But then, that's at your home, but then we still don't want these bears to get used to being around people and coming into neighborhoods, because then if you do encounter one out in the wild, in the woods, if you're, going out to a stream to fish or something, they might be much more likely to approach you or something like that. And so this is relevant for a lot of animals like alligators, bears, lots of animals. We don't ever want to feed them because that's going to make them want to come back for more food, and that's going to make them way more comfortable coming near us. Whereas animals typically, they don't want to come near us any more than we want to go near them. And so storing food is also really important even when you are out in the wild. So if you're hiking, you do not want animals to smell your food. So, we don't want to bother wildlife, but we don't want wildlife bothering us either. So whenever I go hiking in areas where I know bears are present, I always have to toss my food up in a tree so that they can't get to it. Because also if I've hiked, far out into the mountains and I'm, backpacking and I'm relying on that food to get me back out, I also can't take the risk of an animal even getting to it. Even if they don't get to me, they also can't have my food because I still need that, right? And they shouldn't have it anyway. That's not a natural source of food for them. And then one other type of thing to think about is what's a bad time to interact with wildlife? One bad time that you really don't want to interact with wildlife because it could make them a bit more aggressive or defensive is when they're with their young. So I actually took this picture. This is out in the subarctic, and what you can see is that a yearling or a cub is with mom here, this polar bear. And so a lot of bears or other animals will get super defensive and aggressive if they are with their cubs because they want to protect them, right? They want to keep them safe. So be especially aware of when different breeding seasons are happening, or if you ever see wildlife with their young, that's definitely a good time to have that click that you shouldn't mess with that animal at all, and definitely keep an eye on it until you can get away from them. So something else to think about. And then we shouldn't just be thinking about wildlife when we're out there. We should be thinking about others as well. So, always be kind and courteous to others. We're probably going to interact with other people when we're out doing these recreational activities because other people are going to be wanting to do the same thing. So we want to create a positive experience for everybody, right? And that even comes back to leave no trace because, again, if you are, leaving trash, then people are going to see that trash and they don't want to see trash when they're hiking on these natural landscapes. So that's going to create a worse experience because they don't want to see it. There's lots of different types of etiquette or, common practices when you're out in the wild. So there's this kind of unspoken rule when you're hiking that if someone is hiking upward and you're hiking downward, they're doing the more difficult work at the time. And so at least I always do, I always step to the side so that the person who's doing the more strenuous or difficult activity can have the right of way. Because I'm just going downward anyway. I'm already probably on my way out and not pressed for time or anything like that. So it's nice to let, especially if it's a narrow path, it's nice to let people who are doing the more difficult activity to go first. And then a big one is think about noises. So a lot of times, again, these are going to be shared spaces, and not everybody likes the same type of music, right? Or anything like that. Or even just, being loud when it's time to go to sleep. So a lot of campgrounds will have noise restraints after like certain hours. You can't be so loud. So just think about what other people would want to be hearing. It's nice to hear natural things as well, like birds chirping or creeks flowing. And so, doing things like playing loud music or screaming aren't always the best option. And so just, in general, just keep in mind that other people are out there to be enjoying the same things that you are. And with that, that is all I have. So I'm going to stop sharing. But like I mentioned, these guidelines are things that are thought about even by professionals so that they can make these recommendations to people and educate people so that Center for Outdoor Recreation, that Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Recreation, they actually do research on guest experiences in natural parks, national parks, state parks, landscapes, how people behave, how they follow the rules, how they don't. If there's anything they can do to keep these natural landscapes more clean and enjoyable. They provide funding to do this, to support research to learn about impacts on environments when people are visiting all these different areas. So they're really cool, and they're involved with things like the U.S. Forest Service. The National Park System cares a lot about providing resources to keep these areas clean so that when we do continue to visit them in the future, that they're as enjoyable and safe as possible. So I hope this gave you all something to think about when you're out and you're enjoying the great outdoors. It's it's not a serious topic, but it's something to think about, right? Because we want to keep them as healthy, our ecosystems as healthy and enjoyable as possible far into the future. So anything we can do to decrease our impacts when we're out there is going to make them last longer. So I hope this all gave you something to think about and you enjoyed this talk. And thanks so much for joining. Have a good one, everybody.